We're going to begin our review of the evidence by taking a very big step back from current controversies over what's happened in the late 20th or early 21st century. 500 million years, in fact, to the first appearance of complex multi-celled life on Earth. And we're going to be looking at data that is hidden in plain sight. The Royal Tyrell Museum in Midlands Provincial Park outside Drumheller, Alberta is a must-see. It has a spectacular panorama of life on Earth, from the explosion of hopeful monsters in the Cambrian seas through the age of the iconic dinosaurs, so many of whose fossils are found here in the Alberta Badlands, and on into the age of the mammals, including the Ice Age. And when you look at all of this, you're struck by the extraordinary diversity and dynamism, the amazing range of tubes and snouts and horns and claws that living things have sprouted over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. But you also see dramatic evidence of the variability of geography and climate. At the time that those fossils were accumulating here, there was an enormous inland sea separating a western continent from an eastern continent called Appalachia. And the climate here was like South America. There were ferns and a profusion of lush vegetation and swamps. As the museum itself says at the end of its exhibit, the one constant is change, dramatic change of temperature, everything from tropical conditions to an ice age to today's climate. Unusually cool, but not spectacular. It's all here in the museum, and it's all there in the history of the Earth. Now, obviously, this takes us back a lot further than people usually go when they're discussing or debating man-made global warming, long before the appearance of humans. Most alarmist presentations go back 50 years, or at most 150, with an occasional nod to the entire Holocene, that is, the roughly 12,000 years since the last glaciation ended, and they'll engage in the odd piece of disaster-related cherry-picking going back 1,000,000 years or further. And most skeptics of the alarmist thesis therefore also concentrate on the last century, or the last few decades, getting down into the weeds with the alarmists with respect to where weather stations are located or estimates of CO2 forcing. These things are important, of course, and we'll talk about them later in the documentary, but only after creating appropriate context so we know what we're trying to understand and explain. To do otherwise would be like trying to understand the Mona Lisa by looking only at one corner of an eyebrow, or to explain World War I starting in August of 1918. When it comes to these debates over climate change, the explanation that we find convincing depends crucially on what it is that we're trying to explain. If temperature had been essentially stable for thousands or even millions of years and then had suddenly shot up in the second half of the 20th century, then obviously we would be looking for the cause in some sort of recent external shock. But if temperature has been fluctuating for hundreds, thousands, and millions of years, it would be bizarre to expect it to have been stable in the absence of some sort of dramatic recent change. Even on a shorter scale, if we are experiencing a warming trend in recent decades that's been going on since the mid-19th century, it would be not just odd, but demented to seek an explanation that only goes back to 1970. If we're trying to explain the known history just of 20th century climate, then what we need is a theory that can account for 3 fairly rapid rises in temperature, punctuated by 2 fairly rapid coolings. And on the face of it, man-made CO2 is not much of a candidate because it's been rising throughout the whole period and most dramatically in the last 4 decades. If you look at NASA's or the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's charts, those cycles within cycles are plainly visible. They smooth them out and say, nothing to see here, folks. But there is, including the fact that the IPCC's own reviewers admit that the warmest temperatures came in the 1930s after a sharp, unexplained rise around 1920. If we're going back 12,000 years, we need to be aware that there are long cycles of warming and cooling that seem to be trending downwards, not upwards. If we're going back 2.8 million years, we need to be able to explain why it is considerably warmer today than it has been for much of that period. But if we're going back 5 million or 50 million, we need to know why it's currently colder than it has usually been. Because contrary to what is sometimes rather carelessly asserted about, quote, the end of the last ice age, end quote, we are currently in an ice age, defined as a period in which there is significant polar ice on the Earth. We're just in a relatively warm part of that ice age, what's called an interglacial. And thank goodness we aren't an interglacial, or we'd be gnawing mammoth bones somewhere in Tennessee, not sitting in our living rooms watching documentaries with fridges full of ketchup and other such triumphs of human ingenuity. We know, no sane person disputes, that the climate has always been unstable. It has cycles, but they're not regular ones like day and night or even spring, summer, fall, winter. You can kind of sense a rhythm, but you can't tap it out like 1, 2, 3, 4. It's always doing odd things. And so now we're going to take a look at the big picture. Versions of this chart are all over the internet, but it seems to have originated with a West Virginia geologist using 2 independently generated sets of scholarly data. And you see there are 2 lines. One is average global temperature, that's the blue line, and the other one is atmospheric CO2, that's the red line. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the precision of these reconstructions. You can find other charts online that offer refinements of the big picture, though without changing its fundamental contours. But if this chart is even roughly right, you see 3 things immediately. And the first of them, critical to our story, atmospheric CO2 and global temperature do not correlate. Absolutely nobody who wasn't aware of the current controversy over man-made global warming driven by CO2 emissions would look at this chart and say, you know what, the blue line obviously moves in response to what the red line is doing. The second thing that's obvious from this chart is that even on the macro scale, the Earth's climate has been unstable throughout its known geological history. To the extent that, like Obelix, the Earth has a normal condition, you can see that it is considerably warmer than today. Most of the time, the Earth seems to be around 22 degrees centigrade, but periodically it drops down to about 12 degrees centigrade, which is where we are now.